George Carlin was one of the greatest comedians to ever live. His laser-focused rants exposed the stupidity and hypocrisy of his time. The world is ever poorer for losing out on the jokes he could have come up with using the past 16 years of material. But even though he isn't here today, what he accomplished still proves he was far ahead of his time. The topics he ranted about, the vices he exposed, and the points he made are even more relevant today than they were when he was alive.
They got you by the balls!
So let's explore the aspects of society that George Carlin's jokes try to warn us of.
The CIA doesn't kill anybody anymore, they neutralize people. Or they depopulate the area. The government doesn't lie, it engages in disinformation. Contra killers are called freedom fighters. Well, if crime fighters fight crime and firefighters fight fire, what do freedom fighters fight?
It's undeniable that George Carlin was a master comedian. He completely ignored the lines that both regular people and other comedians were too scared to cross. His first special, which brought him to fame, famously relied on the 7 dirty words that didn't let people say on television. While we're used to cursing today, it was revolutionary for the time. George even got arrested in 1972 for performing the act. It wasn't just there for the sake of it though. Underneath the shock value, each of George Carlin's bits were examples of his own personal philosophy of common sense.
Ass is all right on television. You can say on television things like, well, you've made a perfect ass of yourself tonight. But you can't say, hey, let's go get some ass.
What made Carlin such a great comedian was his ability to step back from the cultural and social norms that shaped everyone else's thinking. Instead of just buying into what everyone else was saying, he created his own unique view of the world. Carlin would cut right to the bone, hitting the core of whatever topic he chose. It came from reducing concepts to their simplest form. Regardless of who was pushing it, whether it was a right-wing issue or a left-wing talking point, it didn't matter. George Carlin would strip away the lies people tell themselves and show the real purpose behind it. He attacked the left for their attempts to control language and the political correctness that bogged down their actually worthwhile beliefs. But just after he finished those runs, he gets straight into attacking the religious fervor of the right and their relationship with corporate power. It was this ability to strip away the nonsense that turned him into a modern-day prophet. He knew what the actual reasons were for America and the world's vices, so he naturally knew where they'd lead. And as we go forward, we're going to expose tons of the things that he tried to warn us about. But one of his last predictions is perhaps the most concerning one of all. In an interview taken shortly before his death in June of 2008, he said this, quote, "We're circling the drain right now. Nero is playing his violin. It's all over for America. I can see an out-of-control pandemic wreaking havoc in the country and around the world." George Carlin often used illness and disease as a metaphor, especially in his special titled "You Are All Deceased." But it's eerie how just 12 years later, his prediction of a worldwide destructive epidemic would actually come true. It was something that sped up the clock on his other predictions as well. As for his comments on America, if they haven't already come true, then they're not very far away. So let's explore what else he foresaw for the doomed country. You're being watched. Big tech is tracking your phone and email to know what you do online. This is because your personal information, we're talking information of family members, mailing address, SSN, bank credentials, is all linked to your phone number. And right now, it's out there and easily accessible, which makes you a very easy target for scammers, spammers, fraudsters, and stalkers. And if this information gets in the wrong hands, not only can you be subject to a volume of spam emails and texts, but you also become at risk of being doxxed. In fact, this is becoming so widespread that an identity is stolen every 2 seconds, which is where Cloak comes in. Cloak allows you to generate unique functional emails and phone numbers for any settings so the list of people who are able to track you is 0. By using Cloak, you can identify risks to your identity and ensure that your personal information is removed from the hands of potential bad actors, protecting you and your family going forward. Your digital identity is fully protected when you use Cloak, as Cloak has the ability to generate unlimited masked emails and phone numbers to protect your personal contact information from being shared online, whilst also safeguarding your financial credentials by generating masked credit cards. And you can also use Cloak Scan to understand your digital footprint to see what information about you is being publicly exposed, whilst also allowing you to remove your personal information from over 120 plus data brokers and websites with Cloak data removal. And that's not all, you can also ensure your security with Cloaked Identity Theft Insurance, which offers up to $1 million in identity theft and fraud coverage. Now with all of these tools in one place, it makes it so much easier to identify threats to your digital identity, removing existing personal data that could be exploited, whilst also masking your identity to prevent the generation of new personal data. Plus, with the Cloaked Insurance, you always have the peace of mind knowing that you're protected against potential breaches. So check Cloaked out today by using the link in the description below. One of George Carlin's most famous rants, taken from his 2005 stand-up special, is a collection of these premonitions about America. It really needs to be listened to in full, as each one is more accurate than the last. First, he starts with saying that America has just become one large shopping mall.
And turned it into what it is today, a shopping mall. A big fucking shopping mall.
He talks about how they're everywhere, turning a once beautiful country into a consumerist nightmare. At first, it seems like this is one observation that's actually less true today. Malls are dying off and they have been for years, but it's only because we don't need them anymore. The cycle of an ever-increasing amount of malls and opportunities to consume that George Carlin foresaw has actually been completed. Because today, everyone has their own personal mall in their pocket. Whatever you want to buy is just a few seconds away. You don't even need to leave the house anymore. It's truly the next stage of what George Carlin talks about next: America's addiction to shopping and eating.
Shopping and eating, especially eating. Americans love to eat.
Since he said this in 2005, we've only seen things get worse. Obesity rates have gone up nearly a third, reaching around 42% in 2020. While it wasn't hard to imagine that America would keep getting fatter, it still matches up with the reason that George Carlin gave for it. Now that the mall follows us around each day, people have been able to get even further into their addiction to consuming stuff. At this rate, by 2030, we'll nearly be a 50% obesity. Half of the USA will be so addicted to food and the additives and hormones they add into this food that the population won't be able to control themselves. The techniques they've developed to create and feed this addiction have reached new heights, and the people afflicted by it have sunk to new lows. What about the other kind of consumption that George Carlin talked about, buying stuff? As he puts it, Americans are addicted to spending money they don't have on things they don't need.
Buying things. People spending money they don't have on things they don't need.
As you can imagine, both of these vices have only gotten more widespread. The app Temu is a great example of this. It specializes in selling as much stuff as physically possible, giving their customers the instant satisfaction of consumption. It's nearly all stuff that you don't need, that'll just be taking up space in a landfill sooner or later. As for how they're paying for all of it, people are using so-called buy now, pay later schemes. It's forecasted that in 2024, over 93 million people in America will use this kind of borrowing, over 10% more than the year before. It's the next development in what George Carlin saw. Nearly every single online retailer has built it directly into their website. It's not money that people generally have. 56% of the people using these services have had problems with late repayments. The addictions that modern society pushes on people and their inability to resist them has bled them dry. The core of all of this that George Carlin identifies is how stupid America has made its people. They've been willingly duped into living this way, and it makes everybody dumber. Then he moves on to education as the solution that people always bring up. It's so clear that it's failing that when the next year of kids is dumber and pays less attention, they just lower the passing grades. This is what we saw in 2005, and it's only gotten so much worse in 2024. The pandemic showed us how bad things have really gotten with kids. Instead of lowering grade boundaries, they removed them entirely. There weren't any checks on whether kids were actually doing their work at home, so most didn't even bother. The consequences came fast. Across nearly every single state, math scores went down during the pandemic. Only a quarter of 8th graders were up to the minimum standards, down 8% from the year before. Speak to any teacher and you'll get the same answer. Kids have only gotten more distracted and less engaged. They don't listen in class anymore and they can barely sit still for 5 minutes.
I teach 7th grade, they are still performing on the 4th grade level.
Apparently 2 years of no school and non-stop TikTok reels will do that. It's not that the funding for education in the US is anywhere near sufficient today, but even fixing that would only marginally balance out what's happened to the next generation. It can't stand up to the pressure of instant entertainment and instant consumption. The same things that are making adults dumber today are affecting the kids even more. None of these things that George Carlin foresaw were really that complicated. The evidence is right there, in our faces every day. But the loss of critical thinking has made it so people just can't see it anymore. It takes comedians and philosophers to unravel it all, and George Carlin was both. At the end of this, George reveals the reason for this increasing stupidity at the heart of America. The people who are really in power want it this way. They want people that will consume more and question less.
They don't want a population of citizens capable of critical thinking. They don't want well-informed, well-educated people capable of critical thinking. They're not interested in that. You know what they want? They want obedient workers.
Again, it's something that's only gone further since then. People buy into the two-party system more feverishly and enthusiastically than ever, getting duped into blaming each other rather than the people who actually make the real decisions. He summarizes their aims with a simple statement: they want more for themselves and less for everybody else.
Well, we know what they want. They want more for themselves and less for everybody else.
And it's exactly what they got. Today, the top 10% of the country holds over 2/3 of the wealth, and the poor half of the country only have a measly 2.5% of the total wealth. On the other hand, the wealth of billionaires nearly doubled over the past 4 years alone. It's exactly what he predicted happening in exactly the way he predicted it. The staggering thing is that all of these correct predictions came from just 11 minutes of one of his stand-up specials. It's a message that's both illuminating and depressing, like the truth often is. His rants work because they're true and because they're timeless. The things he says are so true and seem so obvious once we hear them, that it's enough to take us over the lines he crossed. Even just reading his words to yourself would be enough, but it's George Carlin's delivery that really makes it. The bits that most people have seen, his latest specials for HBO, are the result of decades of work creating and evolving his own style. Carlin didn't start out as a voice of the counterculture, challenging the contradictions within society. In fact, in the 1960s, he was actually a pretty standard radio host. For the first few decades of his career, most of his jokes were just observations without any social commentary. He perfected the basics before he used them to create his own style, and that's where his excellent flow comes from. It's how the exact right words just come tumbling effortlessly out of his mouth. He knew when he needed to repeat a phrase for emphasis, or reword the same point a few times for maximum effect. His excellent choice of sharp, simple words also helped as well. It made his rants much more effective in delivering their common sense message. Even later on in his career though, there were still a decent amount of straight jokes and silly routines mixed in. He could be dropping bombs in one sentence then move on to something completely mundane a minute later. It helped package the philosophy into something that regular people could appreciate. What's more effective? The message that reaches 100 people or 10 million. Today, both the right wing and the left constantly try to claim George Carlin as one of their own. His reputation for common sense is so strong that there's an endless amount of random quotes and points that have been made up and attributed to him. In reality, Carlin wasn't a follower of either ideology. He transcended two-party politics. He only followed his own thoughts and opinions. And the result of this, as he said, was that he probably ended up slightly left of center.
Well, I consider the whole country, to be one large political party, two wings. And I'm out of step with both wings, but on some issues, I come closer to the left wing.
It meant that he could turn his razor-sharp focus onto both sides of the spectrum, pointing out the contradictions and stupidity within the narrow views of life. His criticism of the left, for example, would once again show his prophetic insight. All of the problems he saw would only get worse after his death. George Carlin often talked about language, and this was one of the ways the left has really come up short. One of his best bits comes from his observations about soft language. He noticed how words have been changed over time, with each generation, to take the impact out of them. Shell shock from the First War became battle fatigue after that, and eventually ended up as post-traumatic stress disorder. While it might be more medically accurate, it loses the instant meaning that shell shock conveys. This itself has only gotten worse. Those in power do this all the time. When an enemy country kills people, they've murdered civilians. When one of our allies or we do it, people have died after something happened. The intentionality and the blame is often completely taken out of it. This softening and manipulation of language has found its home inevitably in the corporate world. They've turned it into an art form, and taken it past just obscuring the meaning of things. You can create whole sentences out of corporate jargon that actually means absolutely nothing. The left gets so caught up in these language games, as Carlin described in his 1990 show Doing It Again, that they lose sight of what really matters.
We were using that soft language, that language that takes the life out of life. And it is a function of time. It does keep getting worse.
Instead of actually following their own beliefs and fighting for justice, they make people change their language so that the world sounds more equal than it really is. In his time, it was about changing gendered words to sound more neutral. A policeman would become a police officer, a spokesman would become a spokesperson. Today, this too has been taken a step further. It's all about politics and appearances. We've gotten to the point that the left makes more of a fuss over the demographics of Oscar winners than they do about people's rights and freedoms. While George Carlin obviously leaned left in lots of his beliefs, he was clearly disenchanted with how they were evolving over time, making him disenfranchised with the entire political system of America. You see, George Carlin was probably one of the most pro-free speech people to ever walk the earth.
How can you defend the use of words like this on broadcasting stations? Well, you don't have to defend them, I don't think. They are protected by the First Amendment, by free speech, just as in newspapers and books and in films. The broadcast media should be no different.
He spent his life pushing the boundaries and fighting for its place in society. It began with his first comedy special that put him in the national spotlight. 7 Dirty Words eventually led to a Supreme Court case after an uncensored version found its way onto daytime radio. It wasn't just culturally impactful, it was the heart of a legal debate over free speech. It was a struggle that George Carlin would continue until the end of his career, but all those he aligned with politically weren't as devoted to the fight. Instead, it seemed at the time more comedians, more people in Hollywood, were obsessed with sugarcoating offense, and soft language overshadowed it completely. As he said in Doing It Again, language and speech is entirely based on context.
Philosophically, I do not buy the assumption that these words are somehow immoral or indecent in and of themselves. Words are only symbols, and they do not possess those qualities. People can be immoral or indecent. The words themselves cannot harm us.
It's the meanings behind the words that matter, not the words themselves. Tons of Carlin's routines would put him in very hot water today, because people would fail to see the context. You can see the effects of this today. Free speech has become a right-wing issue, if it's even mentioned at all. And yet it should be a fundamental value. This isn't to do with left or right politics at all. This is to do with the bedrock of Western civilization. And the fact that this isn't anymore has put society on a very dark path. What George Carlin warned us about here has already started. We've allowed corporate bodies to censor language and change what people are saying. Look at what's happening on sites like TikTok or even here on YouTube. Even words that aren't curses but just refer to something bad or offensive are banned. We've had countless issues on this channel with having to censor the most milquetoast stuff imaginable. Nobody would ever say unalive if they weren't forced to. Now you might think this wasn't politically motivated, but the pandemic proved some of this wrong. You couldn't even mention it or the Wuhan lab without the fact-check police popping up to make sure everyone had to read the relevant Wikipedia page. And if you mentioned anything else about it, you could have your entire YouTube channel wiped from the platform. And it was the same on every other social media site. George Carlin often talked about the ways they control people. From the media to the elections, the whole system is meant to give the illusion of control while keeping power in the hands of the few. As he predicted, they've only gotten greedier and more controlling since. Modern technology has allowed them to directly interfere with and manipulate speech and discourse between people. As the creation of words like unalive proves though, the truth always exists outside of their reach. In China, one of the biggest modern protests was just a plain white flag on all social media platforms, as it was the only thing that wouldn't be censored. People will always want and need to talk about everything in life. You can't just make some of it go away by pretending it doesn't exist entirely. But it's unfair to give the impression that George Carlin was only taking aim at the left. Tons of his routines are based on the ideas and beliefs that fall squarely within the classic left-wing doctrine.
People to the right of the line, Republicans, they're interested in property. Property, not people. They're soulless.
It wasn't because they were left-wing, it was because they were what he truly believed. Like an increasing number of people today, he was disenfranchised with the very idea of a left-wing, right-wing split. As he said in an appearance on The Late Show in 1996, he didn't like orthodoxy and ideology in general.
I don't like orthodoxy of the left any more than I like orthodoxy of the right. The right-wing Christians are trying to control your behavior. They're trying to control the behavior of other people. The left-wing academics are trying to control the language and behavior of people. I don't like anyone trying to control and dictate to me from an orthodox standpoint.
Both groups tell you what to say and to believe. The only way to truly follow your own reasoning is to abandon the label entirely. That's why the portrayal of free speech was so important and will prove itself as some of his most prophetic work. It wasn't just because it would actively stop him from pursuing his career today. It's because in a world without free speech, it's impossible to get the knowledge you need to make rational decisions in the first place. If you're always hearing just one or two sides, you never get exposed to the other ideas and you can't decide for yourself which ones you truly believe in. This is the source of control that George Carlin talks about. People can be controlled because they behave irrationally and they don't get a chance or they just aren't willing to see the entire picture. A lot of George Carlin's predictions for the future and his work in general was really pessimistic. He didn't see a way for society to redeem itself and get back onto the right path. Maybe the time since his passing has only proved this was true. With the ever-increasing censorship on the internet, the moment might have already passed, but we still have the opportunity to gain some idea of what's really going on, or at least until the establishment claps down even harder. But with the rise of free speech on places like X and other platforms, it does seem like the tide might be changing. The immortality of George Carlin's work and the millions of people still listening to his message today gives us at least some hope for a more rational future.